Great. Thank you, Scott. And welcome everybody. Today we're going to continue our series on problematic conflict. And like I said, this is probably the next 15 or 20 of these that we're going to do, is looking at areas where people get hung up on specific aspects of conflict in their relationship. I don't know if I said this last time or not, but I think conflict is really important to talk about and have skill around, because it's an inherent part of any relationship, especially close relationships. I always say, if there's not conflict in your close relationship, you're not in it, and your partner's not in it. So these tools are not for eliminating conflict, but they're for navigating conflict in a way that ends up being productive. So today we're going to talk about flooding, and I know that I've done at least a webinar or two on flooding in the past. And I think what I've done in the past is look at it from the perspective of when you're flooding, when you're overwhelmed with emotion, which is what flooding means. What can you do about it? So we're going to touch a little bit on that. Mostly I want to talk about why it's important to be able to recognize your partner or whoever you're in a close relationship with, their patterns around flooding. And what you can do to help support full frontal lobe engagement in your relationships. So like I said, flooding is when your nervous system gets overwhelmed with emotion. And this can happen with positive or negative emotion. It doesn't just have to be negative emotion. Flooding is a problem in our relationships, because usually what happens when we flood is outwardly what's going on is not a whole lot. So there's not a lot of engagement. There's not a whole lot of reciprocation. So what our body language may be saying to our partner or our loved one or significant other is, I don't really care and I'm not here. What's going on internally is a lot of emotions. It may be, I'm really scared about where this is headed because I don't want to lose you. Or it may be, what we're talking with and what we're dealing with right now brings up a ton of shame for me. And so I'm attending to my shame instead of attending to the relationship. And often when you're not the person flooding, or when you're outside of flooding, you interpret that as, this person doesn't care and we're done. Really, what flooding indicates is that there is a lot of care going on. There is a lot of feeling wrapped up in the relationship. So we want to get to a point where we can talk about those feelings that we're having and the thoughts that we're having, without our nervous system shutting us down and essentially freezing us out of the relationship, or freezing a partner out of the relationship. So flooding is a physiological phenomenon. It's when your body's fight, flight, freeze, or flee response goes into overdrive, and you're not able to cognitively engage with that. So personally, I think it's important to know what your set points are, so you can tell when you're flooding. I find, for me, a good indicator that I'm flooding is that my thoughts or my words are going a lot faster than my thoughts. Another indicator that I'm flooding is it's hard for me to pause and listen. So there's always, well, I've got to say this and it's important. I've got to say that and it's important. I also notice too, just on a body level, like my body gets really shaky and my breathing gets shallow, which is what happens when our nervous system goes into overdrive. I'd be curious in the chat feature, for those of you who are participating or playing along at home, if you want to put in the chat feature some of the signs you know when you're flooding. How can you tell when your nervous system is going to overdrive? How do you know that your emotions are starting to get to the point where you're having a hard time being effective in your relationship? Put that in the chat feature and I'll share some of that. While you're thinking about that, I want to talk about some effective ways to address flooding with yourself, because that's where all of these relationship skills start, is what I can do for myself in regards to my relationship. So keeping in mind that flooding is it's a nervous system state, like your nervous system is kind of running away with you. First place that I like to check in on is breathing. Is my breathing slow and steady? When it comes to your nervous system and emotions, your brain will follow your body and your body will follow your brain. So if you feel your brain running away with your body, slow your body down. Breathing deep. That might look like some grounding. That might look like some stretching. It may even look like some, if you and your trusted loved one, your trusted partner, know that this is a dynamic for you. You might talk about it ahead of time. Hey, when we flood, what are we going to say to each other? So it may even look like engaging some words. I'm starting to flood right now, so that your partner's alerted to what's happening, and you can take a time out and you can take the space that you need. The gold standard for dealing with flooding in a relationship exchange is 20 minutes of disengagement from whatever the source or the trigger of the flooding is, to attend to your nervous system and calm things down. But that 20 minutes has to be 20 minutes without ruminating on what got you flooded in the first place. So oftentimes at the end of that 20 minutes, we've spent 18 and a half minutes thinking about what had us upset. So we might need to reset the clock once our nervous system starts calming down, and really give ourselves some time to reset. When you use a timeout strategy like that to address flooding in your relationship, it's important to have it be an explicit timeout. Hey, I need to call timeout because I'm starting to flood and it's hard for me to remain present. I want to make sure that I can give you care and connection, and I'm feeling out of touch with that right now. So I'm going to take a break for 20 minutes. I'm going to go for a walk. I'll come back and check in with you. I'll let you know when I'm ready to re-engage in this, because that's one of the big conflict escalating pieces we see come out of flooding. Is it just feels like I'm cutting you off, and I like to, maybe I don't have a broad sample to pull from, but I like to think that most adults have issues around abandonment and being cut off. So when we just end and there's no explanation, that can be really triggering for a partner and hard for us to re-engage. So making that timeout explicit is important. On the other side of things, how to spot flooding in your partner. So from what I've just described, as flooding is your nervous system kind of going into overdrive and your frontal lobe's not present anymore. Can you think of a time, and maybe this can be something that can be shared in the chat, can you think of a time where you've engaged with someone and you felt that from them? Like you can tell that they flooded. You could tell that their emotions kind of took over and they weren't able to be present anymore. What were some of the things that you saw, heard, felt that indicated to you that that person was flooded? Go ahead and put that in the chat, and we can share. I can share some of that insight. This is actually something that I always bring my kids into this. I'm working on with my kids right now who are 6 and 9, where flooding is a daily occurrence because their emotions are way bigger than their brains and bodies know how to deal with. And my kids flood in different ways. My 9-year-old gets this stare, and I see him blink back tears, but he'll like maintain eye contact. He won't talk, he won't move, his body will freeze, and he'll just blink back tears. That's how I can tell when he's flooding. My 6-year-old, when he starts to flood, he starts hitting, punching, getting angry, storming off, yelling. Two very different manifestations of the same thing. One's really reactive and the other one tends to draw back. And it's been really important for me in my relationship with them and parenting that I know how to spot that, because I know what to give them in that. If that comes in the context of, maybe they've broken a rule or they've done something that I'm concerned about, and I need to talk to them, that's a sign for me to stop talking, and it's to get physical. So with my 9-year-old, reaching out and like grabbing his arm or his hand, and making sure that he knows that I love him and that I'm not angry with him or that punishment's not coming. That helps him to calm down. With my 6-year-old, it's a little different. If I reach out and touch him and he's in that hitting, lashing out place, like I'm going to get hit, and that's going to flood me. That's going to make me angry. So with him, I have to do a lot of talking. Like I have to say something like, "Are you upset?" I have to access him in a different way. I have to get him talking about what's going on. Some other indicators that somebody is flooding is it may feel like you're having two separate conversations. So I may be talking about how upset I am that you didn't let me know you're going to be late from work, and you're talking about all of the times that I spent money without you knowing. Usually when the conversation is not tracking, that's a sign that there's great emotion there and that we're having an emotionally based conversation rather than a cognitively based conversation. And so that can be a sign that there's flooding. Just like I would say with on the personal side, if you notice that you're flooding, if you notice your partner's flooding, it can be helpful to get in the practice of asking, how are you feeling right now? Do you need to pause? Can we take a breath? Hey, I want to make sure that the interaction we're having right now ends in us feeling closer and more connected with each other. So if we're not headed there, like, let's course correct, let's take a break. Sometimes changing up the mode of engagement or the level of engagement can help keep the connection strong as we're getting to some of those tougher issues. So that is flooding in a nutshell. So yeah, go out and practice some of those techniques of watching yourself when you flood and spotting this in your partner and engaging them. Can't hear you. There you go.
Thank you, Jon. Yeah, I just in answer to your questions that you wanted people to put in the chat feature, when I'm flooding, I feel it in my chest and stomach. That's where I feel everything. And it's like a little tornado in there. It's every emotion I've got all at once spinning, and it's physical. It's a physiological thing. You know, my brain will start spinning as well, and I start making up stories about what's happening. You hate me, and you know, my shame tapes kick in, and I can go from, you know, something very, very minor to, you know, my life is over and no one's ever going to talk to me again in about 3 seconds. I think that's sort of maybe characteristic of flooding. And then as far as seeing it in other people, I have a sponsee right now, and he floods, and he's like your 9-year-old. He it just goes blank, and there's tears, and it's just it's the complete freeze response of the fight, flight, freeze. And I've learned to do what you do, which is just reach out and put a hand on his shoulder, or even just give him a hug and just pull him in and give him a big hug, and say, okay, it's going to be all right. Let's slow down, and kind of talk. So, yeah, I love when you tell stories about your kids. They're going to turn out very well adjusted.
I'm not so sure about that, and I think they're gonna turn out mortified when they know that, like, their entire life history is out there in the public domain.
They're your practice people.
Right.
Have you ever seen the show? I think it's a Netflix show called Sex Education.
No, I haven't seen that one.
It has Asa Butterfield, and his mother is Gillian Anderson, and she's a sex therapist. And she writes about him, and he's a teenager going through puberty, and he's just like, ah. So yeah, maybe not do that to your kids. Don't write about their puberty.
Try really hard not to.
So we have a question here. Sometimes I get emotional because I don't feel heard, and I start getting flooded with emotion. But then my brain shuts down, and I feel like a statue. I don't feel anything and can't move. Is that the same as flooded?
Yes, yeah, that is the same as flooded. So keep in mind, flooded could be a fight response. It could be a flight response. So it could be to lash out like my 6-year-old. It could be to run away. My spouse she's a flighter. That's how she floods, is avoidance and running away. It could be a freeze response, which is like my 9-year-old. Or it even could be an appease response, which is what I tend to do. So our family is very well rounded. In how we flood. We hit all of those quadrants. You know, so again, the concept behind flooding isn't necessarily that it's not always that I'm shutting down on the outside, although that's how it often shows up. It's that my emotional state has carried me away. So I hear some key things in here. I get emotional because I don't feel heard. So you know what a reliable trigger is for you. And then I start getting flooded with emotions, and my brain shuts down, and I feel like a statue. I don't feel anything, and I can't move. So that's that disconnect. These emotions are so big for me. This is what my body's doing with it. So yeah, that is the same as being flooded, and there's some really good awareness in there. You know, I've had to work on with my own flooding where I tend to appease. I've had to work on some catchphrases that I can go to that buy me some time for my nervous system to come back online and respond. So, you know, I've adopted the phrase, I don't think that's going to work for me, or let me think about that. And that's not really because it doesn't necessarily not work for me or I really have to think about it. It's more like I need some time so that my brain can catch up with where my body's at, and I can make sure that I'm, making some rational decisions and I'm all in on this interaction instead of being flooded.
Yeah. John, by the way, everybody, feel free to ask questions on the Q&A feature about flooding or anything else that happens to be on your mind right now. I'm sure John will be happy to answer.
Yeah.
But you used the word dissociation earlier. And interestingly enough, I was on a Zoom call earlier with Karen Brond, I guess we pronounce it Brown with the D at the end. She's our new clinical director for Seeking Integrity at our LA facility. And we were talking about in therapy when people are talking about particularly trauma experiences, but I think this can also happen just in the course of a relationship. People do leave, they just exit the body. Is that what we're talking about here with I mean, sometimes with flooding? I mean, is that a response to flooding?
I would say that dissociating, that leaving the body, that's a very extreme form of flooding, and that's probably like some chronic flooding. And that's certainly something to look out for if that's happening to you in certain relationship experiences or interactions, or any relationship interactions or experiences. It's important to pay attention to that and know what's going on. Flooding, in the sense that I'm talking about it today, is when you're noticing that you're not quite all in, when you're noticing that you're either holding something back or you're stuck in some way. So it's the very beginning of what you're talking about there, Scott. And as with most things that tend to be hurtful to a relationship dynamic or derailing to what we want, the earlier on we can catch it, the better. So we're talking today, this is some real early intervention type stuff. If you struggle with dissociation, that's something to definitely get some qualified help on. Because that's like I said, that's much further down the spectrum.
Okay.
What we're talking about.
It's a much deeper dive than just emotional flooding. Emotional flooding, now, is it always in the moment thing, or are we also triggered by our past events, like almost a post-traumatic thing?
Oh yeah. So a lot of the couples that I work with, and I'll even see this in groups, so folks that aren't in committed relationships, but in relationship interactions, is I think a large percentage of what we respond to in our partner is historical for us, not historical to the relationship. So I think, what is it that I'm trying to say here? So yeah, it can be a response to an internal stimulus, not necessarily what's going on outside of us. That's why it's so important to communicate about it. Because I've worked with a lot of couples where when the flooding starts, the party that's not flooded will be very, very confused. And sometimes that's because they're not paying attention to what's going on, but often it's because the storyline just changed and they didn't realize that it changed. So one of the things that I work on is to create enough safety so the person who's getting flooded can tell the story about what they were responding to. For me, in the past, a very consistent flooding trigger used to be the tone my spouse would say the word "what" in, or the way that she would question what I was doing or what my motives were. And there was nothing that was overbearing about that. But for me, that feeling of, you clearly don't know what you're doing, so I have to ask about it, that's my history. And so, she could walk into a room where I'm fixing something, and for her to just say, "Oh, what are you working on?" I would be through the roof with annoyance and anger and all of that. I was flooded, but it's not because of what she brought to me. That was my internal response to that external trigger. And I had to get into that history with her over time. I had to explore with her what that was about. And that did a couple of things. When we're able to talk with our partner about where our sensitivities or our enduring vulnerabilities are, it can evoke some greater sensitivity in our partner. Oh, I know that's a sore spot for you, so I'm going to tread carefully because I don't want to hurt you. it can also encourage us to update our storyline. So one of the things I had to confront with my spouse in that is, I know that this is not how she feels about me. I know she doesn't think that I'm an idiot. I know she doesn't think I'm incompetent. In fact, she often tells me the opposite. And so I really had to work to combat that automatic storyline because it wasn't appropriate to the situation that I was in. And so when you have that flooding as a response to internal stimulus, it's still important to talk to someone who's safe, preferably the person who you experience that with, if they're safe enough, because there's some updating to your nervous system that needs to be done.
Yeah, that's my experience too. I had a mother who, I'll use this as an example. I was a swimmer growing up. I was really good. I could win a race by 20 seconds. I'd get out of the water and my mother would tell me all the things I did wrong.
Mm.
And she doesn't even know how to swim. That's my childhood. It didn't matter what I did. My mother would tell me what I should have done.
Mm-hmm.
The message was, you can do anything you want as long as you do it exactly the way I tell you, and you'll never figure it out on your own. And so now any authority figure who questions anything, that hardwired path is still in my brain to get angry, basically. And I will catch myself lashing out sometimes, very inappropriately. And it's not, if I'm dealing with, an equal or somebody that I'm helping, they can question me all they want. It's when somebody in, an authority figure, like my mother was when I was a little kid. And I just carry that with me, and I'm more aware of it now the longer I'm in recovery. But yeah, it floods, and that's the tornado starts spinning, and I make up stories or I lash out.
It can be a really beautiful experience when we're aware of our enduring vulnerabilities and our partner's enduring vulnerabilities. I don't know that flooding ever goes away in a relationship, no matter how safe we feel, but we can really change the meaning of it from something that signals this disconnect that we may not ever be able to come back from, to it now signals this is an opportunity to take care of my hurting partner, or to provide them care that they're in need of right now. So it's kind of it can become a signal to take an opportunity to note that there's pain and there's ongoing hurt there, that we need some help with. And I've worked with couples who have gone from barely able to string together a conversation of 5 coherent sentences back and forth to a couple who attends to each other in such a caring, loving way because they've gotten to know this flooding dynamic, and they've switched what it means. This doesn't mean that my partner doesn't care. It means that my partner really needs my help right now. It means that my partner needs some tenderness from me. And it may not be because I wasn't giving it to them before. It may be they're in this internal state where they need my help, and I'm willing and able to give that.
So let's put this into a recovery dynamic. Let's say we've got a husband who is drinking and doing cocaine and maybe seeing prostitutes, or just relatively common scenario there. Mm-hmm. And a wife who has found out about all of this. She's known about the drinking for years, and she suspected about the cocaine, and she wondered about the cheating, and now she knows through whatever means. And she's incredibly angry and filled with emotions, and she's confronting him, and he's like me, he doesn't handle confrontation very well. Mm-hmm. So he's flooding and lashing out at her, and it's a cycle where, they're both flooding based off of each other's flooding. How do they intervene? How do they stop that when they're in it?
I think the first thing is recognizing the harm that does long term, because I'm guessing if that kind of confrontation doesn't end in a divorce, like immediately, it means there's a reason why we're still wanting to be together and we're wanting to be connected. So I think it first starts with recognizing this pattern that we're in is harmful to us. It's harmful to the connection that we may want. And then I think the intervention first starts with taking some personal responsibility. So I'm a big fan of, when I come to my relationship space, more times than not, I want to bring the best of what I have to offer. And some days that's pretty good, the best of what I have to offer. And other days, the best of what I have to offer is like a grunt when I walk in the door, acknowledging that I'm home and I see you. And then that's all I can do. So that personal responsibility of, I'm not a very good partner for you when my emotions are out of control. So I need to do something about that because I want to be a good partner for you. And vice versa. And it becomes less about who hurt who first and who needs to yield first. And it's just more about, like, these are my emotions, they're my feelings. And I'm the one who's in control of whether or not I engage to you from a place where those emotions have run away with me, or I engage with you from a place where I've worked to contain those emotions a little bit more. So I think that culture of personal responsibility is really, really important. And then when we're not in a flooded state, I think it's really important to plan for times when we are. So are there things that you can say to your partner, or ways you can say it to your partner that is not just blaming? Like, I think of a couple I worked with who was very similar to that scenario you described, Scott. And when her husband would flood, she would say things like, of course, it's all about you. It's always all about you. And I really had to work with her, and I had to work with him on it to be able to put the word shame to it. And over time, what that changed into is either he would be able to say, I have a lot of shame coming up right now, and I'm going to try to stay with you, but like, there's a lot going on for me. Or she would be able to say, I know that this really triggers your shame, and that's not what I'm trying to do. I need to talk to you about what I'm feeling. So can you stay with me? And so just this little change to the dynamic where we could reinterpret what that meant, it made a big difference. But it starts with that, I think, that personal willingness and responsibility not to do further harm to our relationship, or not to do unnecessary harm to our relationship.
Sometimes when I'm working with sponsees in sexual recovery and they're in relationships, and that dynamic is going on where, usually I'm sponsoring the male, and the wife is doing things that trigger him and send him into flooding. And I'll remind him, if she didn't care about you, she wouldn't still be with you. And if you didn't care about her, she wouldn't be able to cause you to flood. I mean, people I don't care about can't make me flood. I mean, they would really have to work to get me to flood. But people that I care about, and they care about me, it's, that's when I'm going to have a reaction, because it hurts more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's the real meaning underneath flooding, is I do care a lot about this. That's why I'm so emotionally impacted by this.
All right, we have another question here. I found myself getting defensive when I would, as an example, trip over my own feet. My husband would say, careful, and I would lash out at him. If I do the same thing in public, I try to make it funny and don't have the same defensive response. How do I change the story that my husband is mocking me or isn't mocking me?
Yeah, so there's a couple of pieces there. The first piece that really stands out to me, I am a notorious trip over your own feet kind of a guy. And I find that the first storyline that comes up for me when I've just about fallen on my face is usually a pretty intense storyline. And it's usually I'm either really defensive or I'm really scared, because physiologically that's what just happened to me. I was literally having to brace myself for impact. So choosing when you start listening to the storyline or which storyline you start responding to is helpful. So, if you know that's or when something big and unexpected happens, if you know that's usually a signal for you to get defensive and triggered, you may want to wait a couple breaths to respond and really start tracking what your thoughts are. Let yourself calm down just a little bit, come down from that, and then see what that looks like. I think the other thing would be to challenge that automatic belief that comes up. So my husband says careful and he must be mocking me. You might want to look for what evidence is there that that's true. Does he usually mock me? Is he usually in a position where he antagonizes me, or is he usually supportive? Because sometimes just because we feel triggered and we feel like we are reactive rather than responsive, it doesn't mean that we're reacting to the wrong thing or we're reacting in the wrong way. It just means we're not quite sure why we're reacting the way that we're reacting. So we've got to do some challenging. Is this overall a supportive person, a supportive relationship? Is this someone who tends to be able to recognize when I'm in pain and they show up and help me? So, if I was really in pain or really scared, would I be getting a different response from my partner? I think a big part of flooding, there's the body calming down. There's also our thought process that can lead to a lot of flooding. And so we have to actively challenge that. We have to always be monitoring what's going on in our head and asking, why am I thinking that way? Why am I believing that way? If there's a good reason to, then I probably want to choose to continue to go down that path. If there's not a good reason to, I want to choose a different response.
When we're to pre-combat flooding, you've talked about things you can say when you feel flooding. You can prepare for it, but in a longer term way to reduce its power. Because I know I'm going to flood when certain things happen. It's going to be my default response.
Mm-hmm.
What things can I do in advance that will reduce it, even that initial impact?
This is where I think the research is really, really fascinating, because you can totally see a brain-body connection here. I've experimented with a little bit of this in my own life. So some long-term things you can do. One of the best things we can do for nervous system regulation is actually mindful meditation. That actually tones the vagal nerve, which is the main nerve that is like the braking system for the nervous system. So when you meditate, that nerve bundle actually becomes more dense. It's like a workout for that. So long term, that's one of the things you can do is have a meditation practice, have a way to mindfully quiet and still yourself. We also see that breath control and cardiovascular health relate to this as well. So this is one of the cases where like the mind will follow the body. So this is something over the last year and a half. I've reduced my resting heart rate by 15 beats a minute. And what I'm noticing, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that over that same period of time, I move to anger a lot less quickly. And when I am angry, I tend to move on from it faster. And part of that is just like when we're angry or when we're flooded, our heart rate automatically goes up. And if your heart has to work hard to go at that higher pace, you're going to have an elevated heart rate for longer. So, a lot of my clients get sick of hearing me say part of your good self-care is diet and exercise. Some of that is because a body that can handle stressors physically can handle stressors emotionally. And so kind of that overall health picture also helps to deal with flooding long-term. Breath control is another thing you mentioned, Scott. You grew up swimming. That's something that I really love doing. And I recently got reacquainted with that as an adult. And one of the things that it did for me is it really tuned up my breath control. So like now other forms of exercise are not as strenuous for me because I can slow down my breathing. I can take deeper breaths. Like I can time it a lot better. And that translates directly into when I'm having one of those days with my kids where I really want to like send them off with the child catcher instead of be their parent, I can slow my breathing down because I've practiced that. There's a lot in the research that indicates that exercise has a direct effect on how we deal with stress in the moment because especially cardiovascular exercise requires us to withstand stress in the body that we don't normally withstand. And that's a huge part of not flooding is when the thoughts come in and says, this is the worst feeling ever and I can't stand it. That's when we're going to have a real escalation of that feeling. When that feeling comes in, we can say, okay, this is going to pass after a little while, or I can start breathing deeper and I can slow things down. what we're telling the body is you can do this and you are going to do this and it'll be okay.
That's actually really interesting. That there is such a, but I guess it makes sense there would be a physiological connection because we experience flooding so in such a physiological way.
Well, one of the ways when I'm working with couples that I start drawing their attention to a flooding dynamic, I have pulse oximeters in my office, those little finger things they put on you at the doctor that measure your oxygen saturation and your heart rate. And the pulse oximeters I have an alarm on them. So when, and we're not like doing jumping jacks in session. So when somebody's heart rate goes up to 100 beats a minute, we know that they're flooding. And so I have an alarm set there and I'll, sit these couples down. And when somebody's beeps, we stop and we talk about, okay, what's going on? What do you notice going on internally? And we work on grounding and soothing one another until that heart rate comes back down to something more like their normal resting heart rate. And so, I think that's one of the most effective ways into dealing with flooding is that physiological route, being able to tell when you're doing it and having effective ways of slowing back down.
You talked about meditation, which is kind of a mental thing. What about things like affirmations? Can that help with flooding?
Yeah. So I worked with a man a couple of years ago who had a hair trigger around anger. So I had him actually write out a statement for how ideally he wanted to deal with angry moments. And I told him to read it at least once a day, more if he was feeling off base with that. And it was a series of affirmations that described how he wanted to respond to anger, how he wanted to respond to his body. And it did some of that same stuff. Like after a couple months, he started saying, in this angry moment, I had this line from my plan come up and I actually felt myself go there and I was able to do that. So, any of that pre-training, any of that, this is how I want to respond. This is how I want to feel. That stuff's all helpful.
And does knowing the underlying stuff that spins us, out of control, sometimes where I overreact, is knowing the underlying issues for me, it seems to help if I know a little bit about where it's coming from. So doing that kind of therapeutic work, how does that help long-term with flooding?
Yeah, long-term it helps a lot because you know what the usual suspects are and you can work on some of those. Short-term, when I'm working with folks on this, I tell them it may not be as important to know right now why you're flooding, just that you are, and that there's some effective things that you can do to deal with this. And once I see that kind of skill or that kind of mastery in the nervous system, when I'm flooding, I can calm myself down. Then that person is much more able to look at some of the bigger picture. Okay, why is this a pattern for me? Where does this come from? Because they can start examining some of those triggers without becoming flooded. Because they now know how to deal with things as they come up. So long-term, yes, knowing why and knowing the patterns is extremely helpful. In the short term, I think all we need to know is that we do flood and that there are ways that we can physiologically bring ourselves down. And it really is a process. Even couples that are on strong footing and have solid connection with each other, they'll deal with flooding still because it's part of the human experience package.
I don't know very much about meditation. I can focus on a guided meditation, but to sit down and sit quietly by myself for 10 or 15 minutes is virtually impossible.
Yeah.
Are there tips for meditation? Are there certain kinds of meditation that are good for this? What should people be looking for?
So the main, there's as many different types of meditation as there are people seeking to learn it. And I think the type of meditation that works best is the one that you like doing. So I'm one too, as far as a personal meditation practice, I've been working on one for a couple years, and after 2 years of practice, I can now sit in silence, just kind of in that meditative state for about 3 minutes before I feel like I'm going crazy. And that's 2 years of progress for me. A guided meditation, I can do for, close to an hour. walking through, thinking about this, scanning that. The key piece of meditation that makes a difference in that nerve is it's the experience of starting with an intention. So I'm starting here, and then I notice my mind or my body kind of going here, and I call it back to here. So every time we do this motion in meditation, that's where the nerve gets strengthened. It's not about being able to maintain this for a long period of time. It's about coming back to whether it's we're trying to clear our mind, whether it's we're trying to think about one thing, just focus on the breath. Every time we come back to that original intention, that's where the nervous system changes. So whatever mode you get into to set you up to do this thing, it's this thing that makes the difference, not necessarily the mode of meditation.
So meditating imperfectly is actually better for strengthening the nerve.
That's what it's all about. Is it's the imperfection in it. It's the deviation from the intention and then coming back to it mindfully. That's where all the work is done.
I've never heard it put that way before. I feel much better about my inability to meditate. I'm doing it right.
Meditation and reaching nirvana are two separate things, and I would go for a goal of a strong meditation practice rather than reaching inner peace.
Yeah, I don't know anybody who's actually reached inner peace for more than about 4 seconds.
Right.
So, everybody, ask some questions, please. I'm sort of, I've had my questions answered here. I don't know.
It's really fun to talk to Scott, but I like hearing from the people who tune in as well. If you have any questions about this or anything else having to do with recovery.
Yeah, this one's not all about me. Much as I'd like to think it is. While people formulate questions, you've been talking about the problematic conflict series that you're doing. Can you just catch me up on what you've covered so far?
On what we've covered so far?
Yeah.
So last time, now I'm going to have to pull up my schedule.
I'm sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. Last time we talked about harsh startup. So how we start a conflict conversation. And that was the first topic in there. We will be covering topics such as compromise, repair attempts, recognizing those. We'll be looking at how your family history may affect you and your relationships. We'll look at jealousy. We'll look at stress, basic values and goals. This is going to take us right up to the end of the year, actually. We're going to look at the role of financial issues in relationships. In a few weeks here, we're going to talk about the concept of negative sentiment override, which is our tendency to put the negative spin on whatever happens versus giving ourselves a menu of options to interpret things from. So I'm really excited about this series because each of them has some very specific skills for getting out of gridlock on it and still allowing conflict to be a part of our relationships because it's necessary.
Yeah. Conflict is how we learn about ourselves and each other. So we strengthen our relationships with conflict. We've got in the chat feature here. Thank you both so much for this information today. Since an MVA, I've suffered with a TBI, brain injury, PTSD, mild depression, and sex addiction all since the accident. I didn't realize until this webinar that I most certainly flood, and so does my husband. Is this being recorded so I can share it with him? Yes, it is. Yep. And I will have it up on our website probably later today or first thing in the morning. So does what this question is talking about, can that raise the level of flooding?
Like brain injury?
Yeah.
One of the things that we see in traumatic brain injury or just trauma in general is there's a real disintegration of the brain. So, the way I think of like the best stage to be set for optimal mental emotional functioning is a brain that is as interconnected as can be. And that's the whole process of growing up, right? We are born children who are completely id, completely instinct and drive. And over time, we learn things like social reciprocity. We learn things like self-control. We learn things like critical thinking. And each one of these skills interconnects our brain in different ways. So in TBI, we can definitely see that there can be more of a disconnect between the limbic system, which is the strong emotional part of the brain, and the outer cortex or the frontal lobe. So this can definitely be exacerbated like that. When it was about 2 years ago this week, I got my first ever concussion from my first ever mountain bike crash. And I felt so tough, but I felt tough having gotten a concussion that way, but I couldn't do a lot of sound. I couldn't do a lot of light. I couldn't do a lot of conversation. And my wife said that was the most boring week of my life. And she said, it was also the most angry week of your life. And I think a lot of that was because my threshold for like new stimulus was just so low. My brain had a big shock and it had to recover from that. So we definitely see in TBI there can be more of a tendency to flood just because the brain isn't connected in the way that it was before, and it may still be working on healing some of those connections.
After a TBI, can people develop a new pathway that will help them with things like flooding?
Yeah, the brain's always growing. It's always adapting. And I think it tends to grow and adapt in whatever way we're kind of pushing it. So the book, I don't know why I picked up this book. It's called My Stroke of Insight by Jon Taylor. She was a neurologist who had a stroke, and she wrote a memoir about her healing process. And there's tons of fascinating insights in there. I think one of the reasons I have it on my bookshelf here, I'm looking at it right now, not because I work with stroke and TBI patients, but because there's just some really good basic insight into optimal neuro growth. And so, yeah, it's definitely possible for the brain to regrow and reconnect. And, there's all sorts of really interesting, I think, miraculous stories about abilities that were lost in an injury or a stroke that were later regained. It can happen for sure.
I also think about, if somebody loses their sight, their hearing improves and their smell improves and their touch improves. The brain compensates even if it can't regain what it lost. The brain will usually compensate. It's wonderfully sort of plastic in that way.
Definitely.
Yeah, we have another question here. I love this one. How can animals help with emotional flooding?
Yeah, there's a lot of research, especially mammals. So our nervous system, our cardiovascular system, our pulmonary system, our breathing, they all function pretty similarly to other mammals. And so just being around the breathing pattern of someone or something that's calmer than you are can be really soothing. So this morning, for example, for me, I have a morning routine that I do that involves some reading, some affirmations, some, reading things that I'm interested, making some plans for the day. My dog she's got a stress injury in her back legs from running and too many adventures. So she's resting. And so this morning I went and I laid down in her bed with her as I was doing my reading, and she was in a really, really deep sleep, and I could hear her breathing really deep. And before too long, I noticed myself syncing with that breathing pattern. There's a lot of research around just like being able to feel the heartbeat of another mammal can be regulating and syncing. I know too, like this is probably a part of another part of the recipe for why flooding is different from, speaking of animals. Like my dog, just petting her, there's something rhythmic and sensory to that. I think few things ground us like getting into the present moment, and few things are more in the present moment than our five senses. And animals are very much a multi-sensory experience. There's also been some research. I'm not sure what institute it comes out of, whether it's the I Love Cats Institute or whether it was like Johns Hopkins or whatever, but they say that the frequency that cats purr is that's a regulating sound for people. So yeah, animals can be extremely helpful with flooding. I know for me, my biggest motivator for exercise is making sure that my dog is not cooped up all day and going sort of crazy. And that's incredibly regulated.
Yeah, I really have a cat. She's right back there now. She was crawling up while John was talking about pets. I find that not this cat so much, but my previous cat was incredibly empathetic. She knew what I was feeling.
Yeah.
And, I could be watching a movie that would make me cry, and she would immediately get up on me and get in my face and lick me and
Yep.
try and soothe me, which was adorable. And she would purr while she did it because, again, as John said, the frequency at which cats purr is healing. It's healing for cats, and I think it's healing for humans too. When cats are injured, they purr because it helps with their process of healing. I don't know how that works, but apparently it does. This cat, not so empathetic, but she's still a baby. So, but yeah, I think and there's studies about people live longer when they have an animal, when they have a pet. I think there's just, and I think that's an emotional thing more than a physical thing. I don't think they do much for us physically, except maybe get us out to exercise like John's dog. But emotionally, there's something soothing about having another being that is completely in the moment all the time.
Yep.
They're like kids, I think, in that respect. They're always in the moment, and there's unconditional love. I don't care what people say about pets. They are unconditional love.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love that.
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of routes to working on this, and I think the common thread in all of them is things that bring us into the present moment and things that bring us into care for ourselves. Our ability to come back from flooding, I think, is largely related to how well we're able to care for ourselves and how effective we are at that. That's a practice. It's not a discovery. It's something that we build over time and through lots of trial and error.
So, wonderful. We got a couple minutes left. John, you want to kind of recap and take us out on today's session?
Yeah. So keep in mind with flooding, this is all about keeping as much of you present in the conversation, the conflict as possible. So know your own patterns of flooding so that you can be responsible with that. You can talk with your partner, take responsible timeouts. It also can be a huge help to know what your partner's patterns around flooding are so you can help them out. Hey, you look really overwhelmed. That looked like that hit you hard. How are you doing? Do you need to take a break? All of that kind of stuff is a way that we can reach out in a very caring way to help our conflict conversations be focused on being able to keep the connection alive rather than getting stuff done. Because that's really what it's about at the end of the day. It's not about how productive we were as a couple or whether we solved our problems. It's about, did I end up feeling like this person has my back, and I'm so glad they do. So this is another route into that. So go practice some self-care and some flooding awareness.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. John will be back next week. Tammy Verhelst will be in her usual spot next week. And so you'll get her instead of me. And she'll be filling in for me on Wednesday with David Fawcett. So there we go. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, John. And we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, everybody.